Hello, and welcome to another incredibly engaging and exciting episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we're going to be talking about the return to work in maybe the city, maybe not. This is why we are bringing our guests to talk about it today. We've got two really incredibly talented and knowledgeable guests to talk about this topic. First is Wendell Cox, who is one of the foremost demographers and urban policy analysts in the world. His company, Demographia, tracks housing prices in every market in the world, so he can tell us what's going on in that regard. And Jerry Sullivan is the senior editor for The Real Deal, which is the leading source of news analysis and commentary for the real estate industry. Jerry now lives in New York, but he's a longtime Southern California person who started Sullivan Says SoCal, and is a former editor of the Los Angeles Business Journal and the Orange County Business Journal. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, maybe we could start with this. Wendell, have you been surprised by the pace of the return to the office? And what are you seeing in your research?
Well, not surprised at all. I guess what's sort of surprising looking back is how long it took to happen, because you know, we have had the technology to do almost what we're doing now for 10 or 15 years or longer, and working at home was not advancing that quickly. It did pass transit nationally in terms of work trip market share or work trip access about 2017, though it leads transit just about everywhere but what I call the six legacy cities, you know, which were places like New York, Chicago, a few places like that. But no, I mean, you think about it, even before 2 years of pandemic, you have a whole bunch of young people that are probably asking the question, why do I need to travel half an hour or an hour each way each day to go to work when I can do it from home? And of course, the Zoom technology made that very clear. The new report, the new survey put out by the Partnership for New York City that came out, I think, just yesterday, maybe it was the day before, really stunning data. And by the way, I can go on forever, so stop me when I need to. Yeah, here we are. Thank you, Marshall, that's great. What they're basically saying now, based upon a survey of the office employers that are members of their organization, and that represents about 1 million employees. Now, south of 59th Street, you have about 1.9 million employees or workers. And that 1.9 million, to tell you something about the significance of New York, has almost as many employees as the downtowns of Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, Seattle, and San Francisco. Those are the next six largest central business districts in the country. So when we see here that, you know, we only got 11% of the people, 11% of the workforce showing up 5 days a week. And it's being spread around. There seems to be a growing consensus that we're going to be looking at a 3-day work week. And by the way, these guys, this organization represents 1 million of the employers that have about overall compared to the 2 million that are south of 59th Street. But the basic point is that the employees are very slow to return, and every indication seems to be that this is going to radically change downtowns. And again, you think about downtown, New York's a very special place. There isn't anything that can compete with it. Chicago is a distant second.
I have to warn you that Jerry is from Chicago, so don't be too
great. I live in the same state and I'm only happy. You know, we're the second worst governed state in the country, and in Illinois. I won't tell you what the worst governed state is. And I'm very happy that we live south of Springfield in southern Illinois, because the bureaucrats don't even know we're here. Because the pandemic has not been much of a problem here, though obviously it's been very bad for some people. But here's what they're finding, and this is in New York, mainly east and west side of Midtown and the financial district. Before the pandemic, 84% of employers basically required 5-day-a-week coming to work. And about 10% were allowing hybrid work of some sort, staying home sometime. Now, in the middle, you see what's happened with respect to employee discretion. The companies these are now policies in place. The companies are allowing more discretionary hybrid work. But look at the difference here. 78% of the employees are going to be working or will be permitted to work a hybrid model. That hybrid model, I suspect, is going to be a 3-day-a-week model for the most part, with an attempt to try to get everybody in on Tuesday through Thursday. That makes an awful lot of sense. And just the last thing, since Marshall is forcing my presentation, what we see happening is we looked at the new 2021 census estimates of population at the metropolitan area level. It is absolutely stunning what has happened in just the last year. And you can see the core counties, and in New York, I count 5 counties as core counties because that's the city of New York. But you can see how domestic migration, the red line, net domestic migration has absolutely plummeted in the core counties of the metropolitan areas of more than 1 million people. You can see that the suburban counties have been doing pretty well over the period, and they did well. And the other thing about it is if you look at places like, think about Seattle, for example. Seattle is the 7th largest business district in the country. They are going through a terrible problem trying to get their employees to come back. And if you look at the data in counties like Clatsop, where Port Angeles is located, and where Ellensburg is, and where Aberdeen is, and all sorts of places that are within 2 long hours of a commute to Seattle, the internal migration has been substantial. And so there, the hybrid model, which might be 1 day a week or 1 day a month, makes a good deal of sense. And that'll be enough now. And I guess
let me get Jerry's take on this.
Yeah.
But Jerry, you're walking around the streets of New York. Your team across the country in different cities is walking around the streets of their cities. You know, one of the big attractions of working in a city was the social side of it, the mingling of people, going to restaurants. What's it like now? You're muted.
I'm in a Starbucks, so I don't want to get too much background noise. So if it's too much, let me know, I'll try and move. But, you know, New York seems to be, you know, coming back somewhat in line. And I think Wendell's right. I see both anecdotally in New York and then from data elsewhere, like the Bay Area Rapid Transit District, there does seem to be a very clear Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday pattern. So New York, I don't have a great point of reference on New York before all this, so I hesitate to say too much. But you know, getting on the subways or walking, or there's life. I don't think it's what it used to be. I think there's still a ways to go, and definitely the staffing. You know, it's not an everyday sort of situation, but I think there's enough of people on 3 days that they're crossing paths. You know, there is some interchange, there is some interaction.
Well, my sense, you talk to employers too, I presume, not just workers. My sense is that the employers are actually scared to push this too hard.
Well, I think that was real true a year ago, and it's become a little less so. I think they're getting a little more comfortable about saying, okay, listen, at some point we're going to have to call people back in or call a different situation. A year ago, nobody wanted to touch that. I think the labor market has eased a little bit, and so it might be a little. And employers have started to figure this out too, but you know it's different in different cities. Today, the State Bar of California said it was going to put its headquarters in San Francisco up on the market because they don't need it because they're going to a 2-day-a-week hybrid model. 2 days.
Wow. So what does all this mean for the people, the small businesses that support the city, you know, the restaurants,
well, you know, it's interesting. And I think that the cost or the detriment is greater the more dense a city is. You know, San Francisco, I was just up there for a week and, you know, it's feeling empty and nature abhors a vacuum. And so you walk up Market Street and have these beautiful broad sidewalks and they're not activated with everyday rush hour traffic. And so, you know, there's problematic traffic. and you go to the San Francisco Center, Westfield's Mall up there, which is actually owned by Unibail in Paris and Brookfield, two huge companies. They have the mall right there on Market Street. And it's looking rugged, and the entrance is, you have two guards at the entrance. It's just not a real welcoming situation. And so I think that there's, leaving the space empty. San Francisco bet big on a lot of companies that could best afford or most likely to allow workers to work from home. And so I went down to, Hayes Valley. So a younger crowd, as restaurants down there, they were packed, but they're not going to the office downtown.
Jerry, I just wanted to, follow up on that, because I was just in New York a couple of weeks, and unlike the rest of you, well, Marshall knows a little bit. I'm a native New Yorker, 120, almost 30 years my family's been there. So what I see was both good stuff and bad. Midtown was not remotely what it was. And a lot of those little businesses, I saw a lot of ground floor vacancies. But when you get away from the Midtown, and I understand Brooklyn is doing great, that people in their neighborhoods are happy. So when you go down, let's say, 2nd or 3rd Avenue, and you go below the 30s, it's as vital as it ever was, except I have to say, as a Alter Kaka, I definitely felt like I was a distinct minority, but it just seems to me that it's likely that these cities will come back, but they'll come back predominantly with young people. They won't be the same pattern. Now, the question I have is, what do you think the pattern will be, and what's going to be the effect on the real estate industry? I mean, there are billions and billions of dollars tied up on buildings that are predicated on a certain cost level, a price level, and 80-90% occupancy. What are you seeing in the market, Jerry?
Right now, nobody's sure. So if you go to a 3-day work week, just from a point of view of occupied space, you have 60% usage, right? And then it becomes logistics on how you move your employees around so that they all have space when they need it and so on. Can you cut 40%? Not necessarily, because what do you do when you have the all hands on deck meeting, right? And you still want that capacity. So I don't think anybody's really too far down the road of figuring it completely out. And that almost has to be force fed. In other words, you almost have to deal with it as it comes and shake it out. I was talking to a broker out in LA, an office broker, and he was just saying, you pencil it out, you work it out, space is space, math is math. If you need everybody there one day, you're going to need the space.
But the question I have is that one of the big attractions of cities is this mixed use concept. The idea that people live within walking distance of their office. I mean, look at you. You live in Midtown East and you work in Midtown West, that's a walk. And as a result of that, the result of kind of spending 24 hours a day in a city, as opposed to commuting in from the suburbs and then commuting back out. Are you seeing any changes in that fundamental trend? Are people kind of leaving, people who have been city dwellers saying, all right, I give up. I'm done with this. I'm going to go move to someplace more bucolic?
I think anybody who has sort of had that as a goal, or, someday I'm going to go up to the Hudson Valley, it sped it up. It certainly put that on fast track. And then I think there's also very much with younger people, it's a cost factor, and how
the city has been so expensive historically to find a spot, and you don't get a lot for your money.
And if you could go to Allentown, Pennsylvania and buy a house for $140,000, and for a year and a half, that was okay because it was complete work from home. Now they're calling you back. Now it's a 90-mile commute or 100-mile commute every day. You might not come back.
Wow.
Right? Or your company might make accommodations. And I think one thing we're going to find out is a lot of these situations were just, they could shape up. They could take shape. Everyone said, okay, do what you got to do. Yeah.
Sorry.
So
your numbers.
now you got to bring it back, and you're going to have to bump into these points of reality that just kind of grew out of this.
But
Yeah.
there's a new reality, for example, in Allentown. Or you could even say Wilkes-Barre, that was the 20th largest metropolitan area in the United States in 1930 and hasn't added anybody to its population since, and is just one county away from the New York metropolitan area. Places like this, for example, Allentown. So your company in New York isn't going to let you work remotely anymore. Maybe a company in Philadelphia will be. It's actually closer to Philadelphia. The interesting thing that happens when people are now moving to a situation where they can come in once a week or once a month or something like that, a lot of these places, the employees are going to have huge or much larger markets to choose from in terms of working, because they'll have more than one major city to go to. And I realize it's hard to imagine anybody finding a job in Philadelphia instead of New York, but you can't tell for sure.
Well, and I think you're right. And we're going to go from the Great Resignation, I think, to the Great Resettlement.
Mm-hmm.
Where people are going to have to figure out, okay, I'm going to quit and get a job here, or the company's going to say, we're going to open a branch office there because there's 6 of you out there, or just say, okay, you can work from remotely and come in once a week. You could come into Manhattan from Allentown once a week. It might be reasonable.
Yeah, well, look at the demographics. Overlay the demographics on this. Typically, taking New York as an example, always been a magnet for young people. Now with the Gen Z and millennial people getting married, starting to forming families without getting married, their rationale is not just economics in terms of I want to get more space for my money, but it's also I need a place for my family. And so they tend to buy something as opposed to rent something. And my sense is that when you do that, your flexibility as a human being to decide, okay, now I'm going to go move myself to Philadelphia becomes a lot less, right? You're going to be wanting to be working closer to where that house that you just bought is. Are we seeing that, Wendell? Are we seeing young people having higher homeownership rates?
Oh, it's too early to tell, but the research is basically saying, and I've been following the Bay Area a lot, like Jerry. The research is basically saying that people in the Bay Area, their first choice is basically to move out to the edge of the metropolitan area. But for those that want to go to complete, 5-day-a-week kind of stuff, that is working from home 5 days a week, they may be moving to the Nevada, to State Line, Nevada. So there's sort of 2 things here. One is sort of the 2-hour commute that takes care of people that are expected to come in a day or so a week, and the other is to go even further.
Are we seeing this sort of thing? I don't know, Jerry, whether you guys cover this, but I know Wendell does in other countries. Other countries, historically, many of them, their downtowns and their urban cores were really where it was at in terms of work. Are we seeing these things happening? I've seen some numbers from Australia that are pretty interesting.
Downtown, the square mile in Melbourne is essentially dead. It may be coming back a little bit now. Sydney has been in terrible shape. Now, the smaller ones, Adelaide and Perth, have done a little better. And I think the smaller metros in this country have done better, the ones that don't have the huge densities. I mean, you think about the densities here. A lot of people don't realize it, but Jerry, if everybody, you think about how many jobs are there in Manhattan for Jerry to take, okay? And all of his other 700,000 or 800,000 fellow resident workers, 3. The biggest is one of the biggest imbalances of jobs and housing in the world. You got about 2 million people, 2.2 million people, I think it is, in Manhattan, and about 800,000 workers. So my God, you can expect it's a wonderful thing for the people who live there, because you've got an infrastructure that's built for 2.2 million people.
I had that same recognition. I said, God, the city's nice now. It's, we walked over to the Museum of Modern Art, that when you take the train up, my daughter's going to school up in Bronxville, and you just take the Metro North. It's half empty. It's Grand Central Station, which I think is one of the great structures in this country, is really open.
Yeah, but so despite the fact that now it's really easy to get around, this actually, now we're about to activate Wendell on his cause célèbre life, which is mass transit. I've got, you've taught me, Wendell, over the years that the whole real estate development rationale for most cities that are considering some form of public transit is to build out within about a mile of what a or metro, rail stop is. It seems to me that this maybe puts that entire equation into question.
Oh, no question about it. Of course, by the way, you need to know that the planners in the United States do not accept the European rule with respect to how far you'll walk from a transit stop. That's 400 meters, a quarter mile. Here they believe that people with cars are going to walk a half a mile. That's why you can find no evidence anywhere of mass transit ever having taken anybody out of their car. It may have taken a carpooler, as has happened in DC, but no. It is a very much changing situation, and it's going to be tough. Especially again, what people again don't realize is again the dominance of New York. Something like, I don't remember the exact number, something like 40% of the commute destinations in the United States are in the city of New York. And if you take all the commute destinations of all transit riders in 6 cities, I don't mean metropolitan areas, I mean Chicago, not Chicago Metro, 60% of transit destinations for work are in 6 cities. You can guess what they are. And those cities have only 1/10 of 60% of the nation's employment. Now, the point is, you look at the data, and you look at the data, which I've done a lot in both the Bay Area and New York and other places, but essentially the Bay Area, the barge has been terrible. Only recently have they gotten above 89% empty. I haven't seen the latest numbers. They're doing better, but they're probably doing the worst in the Bay Area. You go to New York, NJT, New Jersey Transit, the Long Island Railroad, the Metro North, these operations are barely at 50%. The subway has done better. And that's because subway it really has a lot higher percentage of people that need it. How many people are riding the Metro North in from Connecticut that don't have cars? Probably not a lot. So these longer distance services that cater to a more discretionary market, a market that really doesn't need them, are doing much worse.
So Jerry, as you walk around New York, are you a subway rider?
Yes.
And so the fear factor lately has been something that's been played.
Yeah, but he's from Chicago. You can't scare him.
The other thing is that, and I will say this, and don't mean this politically, I'm not a political partisan at all, but just in the brief time that the new mayor has been there, I've seen a big improvement. It was just as much a signal as, okay, this does matter.
That was actually kind of where I was going with it. Here it is. You've got kind of the basic living patterns, and then if you overlay it with a fear of getting on a subway because you're afraid of getting stabbed or something like that, that's just going to be a death knell. And so you're not seeing that, thankfully.
No, I'll tell you, and another thing that New York has is a couple of tabloids that put that on people's minds, and they raise the problems. The tabloids don't so much cover the city as they send up red flags. And so there's some service in that, and they may overdo it here and there, but they do put it on. They put it on the agenda for public concern, and I think that helps address it.
It seems to me, if we look at the politically, we are seeing some signs of sanity in cities. Adams certainly compared to De Blasio, but also here in LA, Caruso. At least is probably going to make the runoff. A wealthy developer, former Republican, has a chance to be mayor of LA. We saw the most recent polls is the extremely permissive DA in San Francisco may get recalled. They recalled the lunatic school board members. So maybe we're seeing something where the real urbanites are beginning to rebel against this crazy regime that we've had. And maybe there's some hope there.
I would notice, yesterday or the day before, I think we broke the story that Steve Soboroff endorsed Karen Bass. Now here's, Steve Soboroff, very prominent developer, also ran for mayor one time. And actually people forget, he got closer to the runoff than people might recall. Karen Bass, who's very much a pronounced progressive, I would say,
Admirer of Fidel Castro.
In any case, but she valued the endorsement of a big real estate developer, which means there's some moderation going on. Something's coming back a little bit. She's aiming for the center, and I think that's where all the reasonable things happen. So I think you might be right, Joel, and I think that's actually sort of a backhanded indicator of that.
Well, and this brings up the other question about that affects the underlying desire of people to either live in a city or not live in a city, which is tackling the homeless problem. So what are you seeing as in terms of positive change, Jerry, or negative change in New York since Adams took over?
Well, since the mayor came in, and I wasn't real familiar with his predecessor, but I've just noticed, again, there's just a sort of stated, as a matter of policy, this is not acceptable, right? And both in terms of safety on the subway, the public health on the streets, the health of the homeless themselves. And so I think it's gone a long way. One thing you have to understand, I think, is that in my view, Manhattan, and I've walked all over it, I'm familiar, its homeless problem is about 1/10 or 1/20 of LA's. It really is not anywhere near.
Yeah, I agree.
What LA is. And again, it gets back to the tabloids and the political culture of New York. I think everybody in New York will say, agree, disagree, but we can't have this. If nothing else, Manhattan's real estate is just too valuable.
How would you
So with all of the development in downtown LA over the past few years, massive amounts of money have moved into trying to make LA's downtown a quote real downtown. Given the scope and size of that homeless problem, and given the desire of people to kind of seemingly move to suburban locales, I mean, how positive are you for the future of LA? No matter who gets elected in this.
I think it's a big challenge, and I think, and this has not been any way an endorsement or a political leaning, but I think candidate Caruso has identified homelessness, housing, corruption.
Right.
And I think those are three legs of a stool that you're going to have to stand those three up if you're going to get this done. And I'm sure Representative Bass has a similar, I don't mean to say that Mr. Cruz has a monopoly on that, but someone's going to have to address those three things and every one of those three things, or just stand by to just rinse and repeat.
At the same time, the development that has occurred in downtown LA has largely been residential. Now, there is, of course, the Korean Airlines building, but there's also the old Crocker headquarters, not the trapezoidal headquarters, but the one that they built in the 60s that was the tallest building when it was built at, I think, 6th and Hill, or not Hill.
Brand.
Yeah, and that building is empty. So I mean, but at the same time, residential downtown is not bad. I mean, it would be conceivable that if they could get the streets cleaned up, you could develop a strong residential community of people that can now walk to work. That's fine. It isn't going to make much difference in LA, but could make a lot of difference downtown LA, in downtown LA.
That's a big if.
I just want to ask, Jerry, just because I can't resist it. What about Chicago? How is that doing relative to New York and the West Coast markets? And it's your hometown.
Yeah, I haven't been there in a while, and I'm not overseeing coverage there. What I get a sense of, though, and what I've heard, we do have a Chicago edition, and I hear a lot about Fulton Market. Okay, it's a new development. It's sort of one of those remakes of the inner city and everything else. And sometimes I think it would be nice to hear about other things, right? And it sounds like maybe something that's drawn a lot of attention, and it probably is a positive development, but I'm not sure how widespread that is in Chicago. The last time I was in Chicago, the downtown was gorgeous.
Yep.
But you got a little bit out, into the neighborhoods, and it was a very different story and feeling pretty rugged. So I can't speak with any sort of expertise, but that was my most recent impression.
So Wendell, let me ask you to kind of prognosticate a little bit. So here we're talking about kind of the social headwinds that are affecting cities. We're talking about the demographic changes that are moving people in greater numbers to want home ownership because they're developing families. And of course, now we are in very uncertain times from an economics perspective with interest rates going up. What is your medium-term outlook on housing prices, on on kind of the economic prosperity of cities?
Well, there are two different issues there. On housing prices, when you think about the markets that are regulated in terms of urban containment, where there's serious limitations on peripheral development, therefore the land market cannot work because the land values at the edge create the land values on the inside. I have no hope whatsoever for California or for Oregon or Washington or Colorado or Miami. New York and Boston are in trouble also, not the same kind of policies, but the same kind of impacts, because again, you go out to the suburbs, there's no place to build. Not that there's no place to.
Just to clarify, by no hope, you mean no hope of falling housing prices?
That's right. That's right. I mean, you may be, no. And my hope is, granted, we can go back to 2008 and we did see falling house prices after the bust, but then they went back up. So I don't think there's going to be any long-term reduction in house prices in the constrained markets. On the other hand, if you go to the rest of the country where things are really pretty good still, I'm hoping that we're going to see a decline in these, what I would call pandemic shot house prices, like Austin. Austin is terribly unaffordable now. There are good reasons for it being more unaffordable than the rest of Texas, but not this much more unaffordable. On the city in general, my sense is, and if you look at the difference in standard of living among the metropolitan areas, it is absolutely stunning. And if you want to see what's going on with respect to domestic migration, you're going to find it is very, very much tied to the cost of living, which is driven by housing affordability. So that now not only do we see Seattle falling into net domestic losses for the first time in 20 years, we see Denver almost there, Portland starting, and Miami had been a basket case for some time. So the point is that a lot of cities are going to do fairly well. And I expect where the market has continued to operate, and that's much of the country, house prices are going to go down. This is a demand shock, I think. Yeah. And that means these places are going to do well. I mean, I think some of the big stuff going on, the Intel investment in Columbus, not only in the plant out in the eastern suburbs, but also some of their commitments to Ohio State and so on. The movement of businesses out of the state of California. I think that you're going to see some new stars. We're not going to see a new New York or a new Los Angeles, but I think the future is going to be in places that are affordable. And by affordable, I mean the cost of living. And with all due respect, I don't see the strategy or the political will anywhere else to bring things back to reason.
And that a great logical ending question for both of you. Is there a strategy? There's not one, obviously you're not seeing one, but is there one that potentially could be put into place that would solve the problem for California or for New York for that matter?
Well, first of all, go ahead.
I'm sorry, the problem of housing, what exact problem are you looking to solve?
The problem of the dual problem of housing costs and people moving out of the area.
Well, I think, one thing we forget is, again, I mentioned the resettlement, or, there's a natural flow to that. People always say we have to build this many houses in Los Angeles or this many units. Well, actually, we don't have to. And they said, well, where will people go? Well, they'll go somewhere else. And, there is a flow to that. That's, I don't think that's impossible. I think to some degree, we better allow that to happen. We need a few new cities here and there, and there's a few tertiary cities that could become secondary cities, and a few secondary cities that could become, big league. I think that's all out there, and it may be at some point a market's mature.
I'm sorry. Yeah, there are, in the good old days when we allowed the market to operate on the periphery, the city continued to expand. Now Many cities are not permitted. Now, and that didn't mean you didn't move to Columbus from Los Angeles for whatever reason. But now you're right. Exactly what's going on is places like, Cincinnati, Des Moines, Omaha, they are coming back. Now, granted, you might not like the weather in Omaha or the weather in Des Moines, but it might be better than a walk-up apartment in the Inland Empire, for example. And so that resettlement that you're talking about is already occurring, and it's being driven a lot by public policy. Now, with respect to, people always ask me, well, what kind of housing policy should we have? I basically say your housing policy should be to stay out of the business, leave it alone. The best policies are in places like Kansas City that are liberally regulated. And at the same time, they make sure they have sewers and sidewalks, but they're not terribly concerned with a whole lot of other stuff that raises costs and drives people away.
And by the way, from our research, also drives business away.
Oh,
If you
absolutely.
don't have businesses hiring people, that's the engine that allows them to be able to afford to buy a house.
Right.
Joel, final question for you.
Yeah, what I really like to know is on focusing on the future. I'm gonna hand out a little thesis about where I think it's going to have to go, and that is cities are going the era of the transactional city that Jean Gottman wrote about many years ago, which really allowed New York, Chicago, San Francisco, three good examples of former industrial cities that had made this transition. And now we're at this next transition. And so the question I have is, can cities reconfigure themselves, turn maybe surplus office and retail into housing, maybe focus more on the neighborhoods? Like I agree with Jerry that to me, what depresses me about Chicago isn't downtown, it's the neighborhoods around downtown. Some of them great neighborhoods with, Wendell and I went to a Polish restaurant at Logan Square. It was empty. And we asked the person, well, how come it's empty? And she said, oh, because everybody goes to the branch in the suburbs. Somehow cities can only survive if they are a choice that people want to make. And right now, that doesn't seem to be the focus. So is it possible that cities can be humanized to the point that they can recover and find something other than the transactional city?
I'll say, certain cities certainly are positioned to. New York certainly is positioned.
Yes.
There's enough museum and just great attractions and just interesting points that New York has a head start. But there's, as Wendell said, there's very few that can compare to New York. The others, I think a lot of cities ought to start to figure out how to manage declining populations. And, I think Joel hit on something that in New York, it was a little relaxed. There was a little more room. It felt kind of nice. And I'll just give you a cautionary tale. I went to school in Milwaukee. And when I was there, Milwaukee was 1 million people, and the metro area was close to 2. And I went back to visit, 15 years later, and it had dropped to maybe 800,000. And it kind of felt like that. The traffic was easy. And now another 15 years later, I went back, and now it's under 500,000, and it doesn't feel good. So yeah, to a certain degree, there can be an easing. And I think if you hit that spot right, it could actually work out well, but be careful. And I think probably somehow cities have to figure out a way to remain ambitious and expect some easing of their population. It's a tough combination to work out. So we'll see.
Wendell, you want the last word?
Yeah, well, the problem, again, if we talk about cities like, and New York, I agree. And New York is really very special. And New York is like nothing that exists in North America. It's not even close. You can't even make decent comparisons. But if you want to talk about San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, Denver, Los Angeles, do you get to the point where the median household can ever afford the median house price? I have my doubts. Maybe you've got yourselves expensive cities. That's why, for example, in a Chapman report, we suggested establishment of what we call the housing opportunity zone, which would go from Reading all the way to El Centro, interior California. On the other side of the Tehachapi, this would include, the northern part, the desert parts of LA County, as well as the Inland Empire and so on. And in those places, roll back the regulations, making housing exempt from CEQA, as the state legislature seems to do about anything it's interested in getting done. And that way you could begin to control the house prices, control the standard of living, and you'd give businesses a place in California to move rather than having to move to Texas.
And of course, if this also caused property in the inner city to go down, then you could do something. I mean, one of the great problems we have in California is the state government wants everybody to build housing where it's most expensive and most difficult to do. And there's no way of doing it. I mean, we now know homeless housing in San Francisco is going at $750,000 a unit. I mean, you can't address these problems this way. So, I mean, certainly, well, I think what we're saying is cities have a great opportunity, but they have to reinvent themselves, and they've got to move away from the current policy agenda.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
This has been a very exciting conversation, and we're looking forward to having you back on another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. Thanks.